Imagine an 8-year-old boy suddenly thrust onto a throne surrounded by corruption, idolatry, and the darkest spiritual chaos his nation had ever known. The temple of God lay in ruins, forgotten and filled with debris. Pagan altars dotted every hillside, and child sacrifice had become commonplace in the valley below Jerusalem. This wasn't just any kingdom in crisis. This was Judah, God's chosen people who had fallen so far. Divine judgment seemed inevitable and inescapable, yet in the midst of this overwhelming darkness, something extraordinary was about to happen. This child king would grow to become the most passionate reformer Israel had ever seen. A ruler so devoted to God that the Bible itself declares no king before or after him would ever match his wholehearted dedication. He would discover a lost sacred book that would shake an entire nation to its core. He would celebrate the greatest Passover since the time of the prophets. But his story would end in a mysterious and tragic decision on a battlefield where he should never have been, changing the fate of his people forever. This is the complete story of Josiah, the boy who became Judah's greatest king, and the man whose legacy would outlive the very kingdom he fought to save. To understand his story, we need to step back and see the context. We must see what Judah looked like before he was born, living through its darkest spiritual nightmare under King Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather. This wasn't just a phase of disobedience, it was a complete abandonment of faith. Manasseh ruled for 55 years, and during that time he systematically dismantled the worship of the true God and replaced it with every kind of evil practice imaginable, leading the people into deep spiritual blindness. 2 Kings 21 verse 2 tells us plainly that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. A tragic reversal of history. But what exactly did that mean for the daily life of the people? Manasseh rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed, erecting altars to Baal and making an Asherah pole just like Ahab, king of Israel. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. The king of God's chosen people was literally looking up at the stars and moon and worshiping creation instead of the Creator, leading his subjects astray. It got worse as 2 Kings 21 verse 4 records something almost unbelievable. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said in Jerusalem, "I will put my name," desecrating the holy sanctuary. Manasseh didn't just allow idol worship in random places. He brought it right into God's house. In both courts of the temple, he built altars to the starry hosts, converting the place of God's presence into a pagan shrine.
Be that young woman.
Then came the most horrifying practice of all, as verse 6 describes how Manasseh sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists, embracing pure darkness.
Jesus.
The valley of Ben Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem, became a place of terror where parents would burn their children as offerings to the god Moloch, believing this would bring them favor from worthless idols made of stone. The screams of innocent children filled the air while their own fathers and mothers watched, trapped in a deception so deep that they sacrificed their own future to gods that could not hear, see, or save them.
And show us mercy.
Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. Anyone who spoke out against his evil practices or remained faithful to the Lord was killed, leaving the streets of the holy city red. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 9 sums up the tragedy perfectly, stating that Manasseh led Judah and the people of Jerusalem astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before them. Think about that statement, that God had driven out the Canaanites because of their wickedness, and now his own people were acting even worse than those pagan nations had been, inviting the same divine judgment. This was the spiritual climate that would shape the world Josiah would be born into. A kingdom that had forgotten its God, a people drowning in darkness, and a future that looked absolutely hopeless and condemned. After 55 long years, Manasseh finally died and was buried in his palace garden. For a brief moment, there might have been hope that things would change, that the nightmare would finally come to an end for Judah. Perhaps his son Amon would see the error of his father's ways and turn the nation back to God. But that hope died quickly as Amon proved to be just as committed to darkness as his father had been before him. Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and 2 Kings 21 verse 20 tells us exactly what kind of ruler he would be. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as his father Manasseh had done. There would be no repentance, no reform, and no return to the ways of the Lord. Verse 21 makes it even clearer that he followed completely the ways of his father, worshiping the idols his father had worshipped. Amon didn't just continue his father's policies, he embraced them completely. Every altar to Baal that Manasseh had built remained standing. Every Asherah pole stayed in place, and the high places continued to operate. The temple of the Lord remained defiled with pagan altars. But there was one critical difference between father and son that the Bible makes sure to point out, a distinction that sealed Amon's tragic fate. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 23 records that unlike his father Manasseh, he did not humble himself before the Lord. Instead, Amon increased his guilt, refusing the path of redemption his father found. You see, late in Manasseh's life, something remarkable had happened. After being taken captive to Babylon, Manasseh had humbled himself before God, repented of his sins, and was miraculously restored to his throne. 2 Chronicles 33 describes how he removed the foreign gods from the temple and tried to undo some of the damage he had caused. A desperate last-minute attempt to make things right before he died. It was too little too late to save the nation from judgment, but at least Manasseh had recognized his evil and turned back to God before he died, offering a glimmer of hope that mercy was still possible. Amon knew this story. He had watched his father's transformation and seen genuine repentance. He had heard about God's mercy, but he chose to ignore it all and cling to the darkness he had grown to love. He looked at his father's 55 years of evil and decided that was what he wanted to follow, not the humble repentance at the end. So Judah continued its downward spiral into inevitable spiritual collapse. The brief reign of Amon, only 2 years according to 2 Kings 21 verse 19, would be marked by the same darkness that had characterized most of Manasseh's rule, suffocating the land.
Take this beggar away.
The idols remained, the innocent blood continued to flow, the temple stayed defiled, and in the royal palace a young boy named Josiah was growing up, watching everything unfold around him in silence. He was being raised in the most corrupt environment imaginable, surrounded by people who had turned their backs on the God of their fathers. No one could have predicted what this child would one day become.
I have traveled far to...
Amon's reign came to a sudden and violent end after just 2 years on the throne. Something happened that shook the entire kingdom, a betrayal that would alter the course of history for the nation of Judah. 2 Kings 21 verse 23 records the shocking event that Amon's officials conspired against him and assassinated the king in his palace, a bloody coup carried out by his own inner circle. This wasn't an attack from outside enemies or a rebellion from the common people. This was an inside job, a betrayal from the very people closest to the king, the men who served him daily in the royal court. The men who had access to the royal chambers, who were supposed to protect and support him, turned against him and killed him in his own house, leaving the throne vacant and the nation in chaos. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly why they did it or who these conspirators were. We don't know their names or their specific motivations, but we can piece together some reasonable ideas about their intent. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly why they did it or who these conspirators were. We don't know their names or their specific motivations, but we can piece together some reasonable ideas about their intent. Perhaps they were tired of the moral decay that was destroying the nation, or maybe they feared that Amon's wickedness would bring God's judgment down on everyone, prompting them to take desperate action.
We covered everything. We must...
Unlike the northern kingdom of Israel, where kings were regularly overthrown and assassinated, the southern kingdom of Judah had maintained a fairly stable line of succession through David's descendants for centuries. For royal officials to actually murder their king showed just how desperate and chaotic things had become. The assassination created immediate chaos, raising the terrifying question of who would rule the nation now. Amon had a son, but he was only 8 years old, far too young to defend himself or claim the throne through strength. He was a vulnerable child surrounded by the very men who had murdered his father. The conspirators who had killed Amon might have had their own plans for who should rule. Perhaps they wanted to install a puppet king they could control, or maybe they intended to end David's dynasty altogether.
Rule the Near East.
But they didn't get the chance to find out because the power vacuum they had created wouldn't last long. The people of Judah were about to make a decision that would change everything for their future. Not the nobility, not the priests, not the wealthy elite, but the common people of the land were about to rise up. The 8-year-old boy in the palace was about to become king against all odds. The grandson of the wicked Manasseh and the son of the murdered Amon was about to be thrust into power, and no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted what would happen next in this saga. What happened next shows us something powerful about the common people of Judah. They had endured 57 years of wicked kings, yet they weren't ready to give up on David's dynasty or God's promises.